Awesome, we are almost there. We have now rotoscoped Walter and myself, so we can deal with them as independent visual elements separate from the rest of the footage. Now it's time to create the actual morph effect and add some cool effects like sparks and glows and color grading and make it all come together. So let's jump into Adobe After Effects and finish off the final effect. This is exactly where we left off in the last lesson. I have the two layers here for my base footage, and then I've got a layer where I've rotoscoped out Tobias during the morph transition and one where I've rotoscoped out just Walter. Now, because I want to make this course as easy as possible for you to follow along, I will not expect you to do all of this rotoscoping yourself. Instead, I've actually rendered out this layer of Walter on a transparent background, as well as this layer of Tobias on a transparent background, so you don't have to create these yourself. You can simply import the ones I've prepared for you. So let's delete these two comp layers, and let's import those two rotoscope clips. In your course materials, under the video folder, you will find a morph effect -Tobias roto and a morph effect -Walter roto clip. So let's select both of those and import them into our project. And let's drag both of these clips. Yes, you can drag multiple layers at the same time into our composition. But again, I'm not going to drop it into the layer window. Instead, I'm going to come to where I know my transition will take place and kind of drag it to somewhere right around there. And just to show you, let's solo out the morph effect -Tobias roto layer. So again, this is just a roto clip during the morph transition of Tobias, and it's rendered out on a transparent background. And then I have the same for Walter on a transparent background. So you can simply use these two clips instead of having to rotoscope everything yourself. Though the act of rotoscoping, especially using masks, is definitely a learning experience that might be worth having, because in the future, you may come up with different projects or visual effects where you will have to do that work yourself. Now, one thing you will have to do, you will have to align these ones time-wise. So let's solo the base Walter transformation and the Walter roto clip. And let's come to where Walter is whirling that stick around, because in here it's probably going to be more obvious to align these two clips. And if you drag the roto layer over that, let's make sure these two align perfectly. Yep, cool. So those two now seem to be in sync. And let's unsolo those and solo out the base footage for Tobias and the Tobias roto layer. Let's pull this layer forward again, because I do want my morph effect to be just a little bit longer. And if you can't see anything, make sure you haven't set the opacity to 0. So let's press T. And yes, we have animated the opacity. So let's bring this back up to 100% and disable the stopwatch icon for now. And let's grab the Tobias roto layer and drag that in place. For that, let's move to where I'm moving my arm, because it's just a little bit more obvious to see whether these two clips are properly aligned. And that looks about all right. So that's the solo layer, and then that's with the base footage. So those two clips are now properly aligned. And we can start creating the morph effect. One last thing I want to clean up though, if you come to the beginning of your composition, you may notice that this isn't actually at 0 seconds. This is at 7 minutes and 30 seconds in. And that's just due to the way we've created this composition, because the Walter transformation MP4 base footage that we used has some starting timecode information embedded in it. So what I'm going to do is, in my Walter transformation composition, simply right click, come up into the composition settings, and under the start timecode, let's just wipe this out and simply put 0 in here, hit OK. And now your composition starts at 0 seconds, which makes a whole lot more sense. So there's our actual clip. Let's unsolo all layers, but let's hide these two roto layers. And what I might do, I actually might rename all of my layers, because it's just a bit hard to read. The names are pretty long. So let's rename the top one here to Tobias roto. The bottom one is morph effect -Walter roto. Let's just rename this just to Walter roto. The next one down is the base footage with me, so let's rename this one to base Tobias. And the very bottom one is the clip of Walter, so let's call this one base Walter. Maybe I'm a little bit OCD, but this makes so much more sense to me. It's much easier to see what is what in your composition, and especially if you start building up a whole bunch of different layers, this is going to be really, really useful. Now, there are different ways to actually pull this morph effect off. So just keep in mind that the way I'm doing this here is just one of a myriad of different ways that you could be going about this. So feel free to tweak and experiment in any way that you want. What I'm going to do, especially to also deal with the fact that I'm standing a little bit off from where Walter is, I'm going to fade across, but I'm not going to show both Tobias and Walter at the same time, not even while they're semi-transparent. Instead, let's disable the visibility of the base Tobias layer, so we really just have Walter, and I actually want to fade Walter away from this shot. Now, the only way I can do that is if you've also filmed that scene without anyone in it. That plain background image without any actors in the shot is usually referred to as a clean plate, and I have already prepared one that we can import in our project. So let's import some more files, and in the course materials, under the images folder, you should find a Walter Morph clean plate PNG. Let's bring that in and drop it into our composition, and right now I'm just going to drop it at the very top, and that is the exact same shot but without anyone in it. So now what I can do, I can grab this clean plate and drag it to the very bottom, and now select the base Walter layer, press T to reveal the opacity, and now if you lower that, we essentially have Walter fading out of this shot, or well, at least it looks that way. The cool thing is we can now animate Walter to slowly fade away, and independently we can then decide when to fade Tobias in. So let's come to the beginning of this fairy transformation, maybe to about there. Let's enable the stopwatch icon on the opacity property, make sure it's set to 100%. Let's go fairly far in, and let me zoom in a little bit. I want to make sure that my timeline indicator still is over this rotor layer, so that at this point in time, we still have a layer of just Walter, because we want to add a few glow effects and other things. So before this rotor layer finishes, I need to have Walter faded out all the way to 0. So right about at this point in time, let's lower the opacity to 0%. Select both keyframes and press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. Now, if you rewind and play this back, and Walter is slowly fading out to nothing. Next, let's fade in Tobias as Walter is fading out. For that, let's re-enable the visibility on the base Tobias layer. Press T to reveal the opacity property. Let's enable keyframes on the opacity property. This time I'm going to start out with 0. Just move forward a little bit. We're going to tweak this timing in just a second and bring this opacity up to 100. So now what we have is, as Walter fades out, Tobias fades in. Now, one thing I really don't want at any point in time both Tobias and Walter visible, because it makes it really clear that we're not standing in the same location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this end keyframe for Walter forward so that I'm essentially having Walter all the way faded out just before Tobias comes in. Also, again, make sure you select your keyframes and press F9 for Bezier interpolation. It just will look a little bit more organic and smooth. And let's drag these keyframes around so that Walter starts fading out. And just as Walter is no longer visible, we've got Tobias coming in. But at no point in time can you actually see both images. And therefore, it's not as obvious that I'm actually changing position. Now, if you make this transition too quick, you will still be able to see that change, but we're also going to cover this up with a whole bunch of particles and glow and other effects, so it will be a whole lot less obvious. Maybe I'm just bringing this in just a little bit more to make sure there's a small break where neither of them is visible at all, and then Tobias fades back in. And again, make sure that Tobias is faded in to 100% before we reach the end of this Tobias rotor layer, so that by the time we can no longer apply effects specifically to my outline, we will be fully faded in and it'll just kind of cut across to the full Tobias clip, and then the transition should be complete. So that actually looks pretty good to me. Let's start adding some particles. Let's collapse all of our layers. And again, particles are kind of outside of the scope of this course. And yes, I keep reminding people there are tutorials on my YouTube channel for how to work with particles if you want to check that out. I've pre-rendered you some that you can just use for this course. So let's import another file into our project. And this time, under the course materials, in the effects folder, you will find a file called morphparticles.mp4. Let's import that into our project and drag it into the composition. And I'm going to drag this to somewhere right about here. And what this is essentially just one big video of lots and lots and lots of particles. Let's change the blend mode of this layer from normal over to add, so that the particles are being added on top. And yeah, this doesn't really work. I really just want the particles to be where Walter and Tobias are. I don't want them everywhere else on this footage. Also, maybe I want a bit more particles. I like a lot of sparkles, a lot of glow, because we do need to cover up this transition. So let me actually duplicate this Morph Particles clip. Just offset this a little bit. So I'm just going to push this over to the left-hand side a little. And yes, I'm getting a harsh edge here, but as long as the particles cover all of the area where Walter stands and all of the area where Tobias stands. This should be working just fine. Now, in order to deal with both of these particle layers as if they were one, we do need to pre-compose them. So let's select both particle layers, press Ctrl Shift and C or Command Shift and C if you're on a Mac, and let's call this one Particles Comp. You won't have a choice but to move all attributes into the new composition because we have more than one layer that we're pre-composing, and just leave all of the other options on default. Let's hit OK. And this now turned into one layer, but again the blend mode has gone back to normal, so let's change this back to additive. And because I ended up with one really long stretch of footage where I can't actually tell where the particles are starting, they're kind of starting probably right about there. What you can do, you can actually jump into this composition. So let's double click. You can actually click the name in your layers window or actually the bar in your timeline as well. So just double click on that to jump into the composition. Move the timeline indicator to the beginning of those clips and again hold down Shift so it snaps to that point. Return to the Walter Ferry transformation composition. And this is now the time where the layers actually kick in. And with the Particles Comp layer selected, you can press star on your numpad to place a marker. That will add a little bit of a marker to this layer, so we know that's where it starts. You can also trim in the beginning. And again, you can either drag this holding down Shift to snap, or just leave it out on the left and press Alt or Option and then left square bracket to just snap it to that point. So we kind of just know where the particles start, and they're definitely starting too early. So let's come to where Walter actually touches his head with that fairy stick, which is probably right about there. Let's just drag this forward so time-wise it aligns, so the particles spawn after Walter casts that spell on him, so maybe a little bit earlier as well. So right about there is when all of the particles come in. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to limit those particles to only appear where Walter stands and then where I'm standing. For that, we are going to use a track mat, and this is where the rotor layers will start coming in handy because you now need to apply effects or restrict certain effects to only the area of the people that you're trying to morph between. So let's take the Walter rotor and Tobias rotor layer and duplicate them by pressing Ctrl or Command D. Bring these ones all the way to the top. Move the timeline indicator to the beginning of these two layers. Let's enable the visibility. And by the way, if you have multiple layers selected and you change any of the properties, that will be applied to all of those layers. So if I changed the blend mode for Tobias rotor 2 while also having Walter rotor 2 selected, let's change this to add. It will change both of those layers blend mode, but I do really want to keep them on normal in this case. Let's pre-compose those two layers again by pressing Ctrl Shift and C or Command Shift and C. Let's call this one Particles Matte Comp. And again, move all attributes into the new composition, hit OK. Because I know this is where my layer starts, let's also trim down this new composition to only start at that point by pressing down Alt or Option and left square bracket. So we're kind of just trimming it so it aligns nicely. Let's double click to jump into this Particles Matte Comp. And right now we have both the Walter and Tobias layers visible at the same time. Now, I don't really want to start out this way. I actually want to fade Tobias in, but remember, this is really just the mat that will define where those particles are visible. So let's select the Tobias rotor 2 layer, press T to read the opacity, click on the stopwatch icon to enable keyframes for the opacity property, and just make sure you're at the beginning of the layer and bring the opacity down to 0. Let's scrub forward a little bit. Let's bring this up to 100. And for the particles mat, I don't actually mind that both Walter and Tobias are visible at the same time because again, it's just going to control where the particles are being spawned and during this transition. So right now, here in this middle section, I actually do want the particles to be spawned both in the position where Walter is standing and also in the position where Tobias is going to be. So in my particles mat comp, I don't mind that they're both visible at the same time. Then towards the end, maybe we're going to the end of the Walter rotor layer, press T to reveal the opacity, enable the stopwatch icon, bring the opacity down to 0, come forward a little bit, and let's just jack this up to 100. Again, select all of your keyframes, and you can just click and drag a rectangle around all of them, press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation, and so now we're essentially starting out with Walter, Tobias fades in, and then there should be particles all over the place, and then they're fading out and they'll only be over Tobias. Cool, that looks alright. Let's jump back to the Walter Ferry transformation. Make sure that this Particles Matte Comp layer sits on top of your Particles Comp, and now on your Particles Comp, change the Track Matte option from No Matte to Alpha Matte. Again, if you can't see this column, simply click on your toggle switches and modes button down here at the bottom, or just press F4 on your keyboard. So now we have restricted all those particles to only appear where Walter is standing and where Tobias is fading in. So now, if you scrub through this, you can see the particles only appear over Walter. You can kind of start seeing they're also appearing where Tobias is going to fade in. And at the end, they're only left where I'm standing. Now, they are snapping off. At the end, they're kind of being cut off. And the reason that is actually happening is because our particles comp mat, which only contains our two rotor layers, ends. So at this point, it just vanishes, right? And because we're using this layer as a track mat on our particles, and our particles, track mat is set to alpha, means that the moment the visibility of the layer above it vanishes, the particles no longer will be visible. However, we kind of do want this to remain visible until the particles are properly faded out. And in order to do that, we can simply extend the length of this particle mat comp. In order to do that, right-click onto the particles mat comp, come up into time, and then select to enable time remapping. Time remapping essentially allows you to screw with the timing of your layer in any way that you want. You can see a value here that indicates what time this layer currently is at, so it's at 8:05 seconds. So there we're playing through up until about 8:16, and then that layer actually becomes invisible. Let's enable the visibility of this layer and solo it just so we can see what's going on. So it's essentially just plays back that track mat, and around 8:16 it just vanishes. Now, however, because we've enabled time remapping, we can place new keyframes to define the time of the clip. So let's come to the last frame where this particle mat's comp is still visible, which is at 8:16. Let's place a keyframe here to say at this point you have to be at 8:16. Let's move forward to the end of our composition and you should find another keyframe at the end. And this actually indicates that at this point the time for this layer will be at 18 seconds and 08. But if we delete this keyframe, the last value will be held, and that is defined by this keyframe to be 8:16. So past this keyframe, the timing of this layer is held at 8 seconds and 16 frames in. So past this point, it just stops playing, it just pauses. Now, there's a whole lot of other cool things that you can do with time remapping, but this is really all we wanted to do. Let's unsolo this layer and hide this particles mat comp. And now if you scrub through it, you should see the particles nicely fade away because this particles mat comp remains visible. So the particles now slowly fade away over me. And that's looking a whole lot nicer. Now, right now, the edges of this track mat are way too harsh. It looks a little bit like an alien effect from the 80s. In order to fix that up, simply come into the Effects and Presets panel and let's search for the Fast Blur effect. I'm going to use the Fast Blur Legacy effect just so that anyone can follow along, even if you have an older version of Adobe After Effects. Let's apply this effect to the particles mat comp, and let's just simply bring up the blurriness just a little bit. So we're kind of softening out the edges here, maybe around 20. I probably don't want to go too crazy, just soften out the edges a little bit. Let's rewind and play this back. Cool, and that is looking a whole lot better. Now the next thing I want to do, I want to add a little bit of shine, like light rays radiating out from Walter's body as he's morphing into Tobias. For that, I do need to add an effect to these particles. Now your instinct might be to add an effect to this particles comp. However, the visibility of this comp, including any effects that you add to it, are restricted by this particles mat comp, so the effects won't be able to reach outside of the area of this mat. Because that's not what we want, in order to deal with these particles as if they were only defined where Walter and Tobias are standing, we, once again, need to pre-compose those two layers. So let's select the particles comp, the particles mat comp, and let's pre-compose those two layers. This time, just for fun, let's come up into the main menu, select layer, and then pre-compose. Let's call this one Morph Particles Comp, hit OK. And because the blend mode has once again changed to normal, let's flip this back to additive, so we're back to where we were. Let's duplicate this Morph Particles Comp layer, and I'm going to rename this layer to Particles Shine. And now come into the Effects and Presets panel and search for the Radial Blur effect. You should find the Radial Blur under Blur and Sharpen, and again I'm not going to use the CC version because it's only available in After Effects CC. I'm just going to use the old style Radial Blur. Let's apply that to our Particles Shine layer. And you can see this kind of does a little bit of like a spin blur on our layer. And that's because in our effect settings under the radial blur, the type is currently set to spin. Let's change this from spin over to zoom. And that might be a little bit hard to see. But now, if in the radial blur we pump up this amount to maybe 100 or 200, what happens is that you get these really cool light streaks shooting out of the particles. And what's even better, you can actually move this center position around. Right now it's kind of hidden behind my layer center, but I can actually click and drag this around. And this moves the center position of where this radial blur is emitting from. You can also simply click on this little target icon and click on Walter's face, for example. And you'll see the rays are now emitting from his face. Maybe we'll jack this amount up to around about 200. And again, feel free to adjust this and experiment in any way that you want. Let's come back to the beginning where the effect starts kicking in. Now, as I scrub through my composition, you can see it's taking a little bit longer now to render because the radial blur effect is not the fastest. Now, while I do like that the rays start at the head, I don't like that it ends there. I kind of want to animate this center position to kind of move from the head downwards along the body, so those rays are starting to slowly animate and beam upwards as this morph effect happens. So let's come to the beginning of this transition where the particles are kicking in. Let's set a keyframe for the center position, being right on Walter's head. Let's come to the end where maybe there's just a few particles left, maybe right about here, and let's grab this center position and drag it downwards to maybe right between my knees. Let's rewind and check this out. And that is starting to look pretty cool. With the particle shines layer selected, press U to reveal all of the keyframes. Select all of them, press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. Maybe I'll just drag the last keyframe out just a little bit more. The last thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of an intense, more colorful glow. For that, once again, we can use this Tobias rotor layer. Let me enable the visibility, solo it, and let's actually rename this one to Tobias Glow. Then come into the Effects and Presets panel and search for the Glow effect. Under Stylize, you should find a Glow effect. Let's grab this and apply it to the Tobias Glow layer. And for this layer, I actually only want the glow. So in the settings for the Glow effect, change the Composite Original dropdown from behind to none. And change the glow operation from add to none. We're only going to be left with the actual glow that gets generated. And then you bring down the threshold a fair bit. I want most of the Tobias rotor layer to glow. I'm going to jack up the radius to maybe around 150 to almost 200. So this should be a really nice glow layer. Then let's change the blend mode from normal over to add. And of course, you probably want to unsolo this layer. This now adds this really nice, intense and colorful glow into the effect. And if you scrub back a little bit, well, it probably starts a little bit too early. So again, we kind of need to fade this glow in. For that, with the Tobias Glow layer selected, press T to reveal the opacity. Let's come to where Walter starts transforming, maybe right about here when the first of those particles start to appear. Set a keyframe for the opacity at 0%. Let's come down to maybe around about the middle of the transition where neither Walter nor Tobias are actually visible. Let's bring up the opacity, and you don't have to push it all the way to 100%. Maybe I'm going to go with around the 75. I think that seems like it'll be plenty. Let's keep moving forward until Tobias has appeared. And obviously before this rotor layer has come to an end, let's lower the opacity back to 0%. Select all of those keyframes, press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. And again, let's rewind and play this back. Cool, that is really starting to look nice. Now maybe I want to bring the value on this middle keyframe down a little bit. And again, hold down Shift to move the cursor right onto the keyframe, or press K to jump to the next one, J to jump to the previous keyframe. So on this keyframe, maybe I'll bring this down to maybe around about 50%. I don't want this to be too intense because I'm also going to add a little bit of glow to Walter as he's going into the morph transition. For that, we can use the Walter rotor layer. Let's enable the visibility and solo this layer. And again, let's apply a glow effect to the Walter rotor layer. I'm also going to rename this one to Walter Glow. And same as before, in the effect settings for the glow effect, let's change Composite Original to none and glow operation to none. Let's bring down the threshold and bump up the radius. This time I'm going to go a fair bit, and I do want to avoid this massive blob of white right here. So I'm also going to bring down the glow intensity to maybe around about 2 or 3. Maybe I'll bump the radius up just a little bit past the 200, and I'll bring the threshold down just a bit more. So really just getting a fairly diffuse blob of glow. Let's unsolo the layer, change the blend mode from normal over to add. So that's now just adding a little bit of glow onto Walter. And again, because it's kind of just popping in, we need to animate the opacity. So with the Walter glow layer selected, press T to reveal the opacity, set a keyframe. Let's start this out at 0. Let's come to about the middle of the morph effect and bring the opacity up. I really just want to add a little bit, maybe 30, 20%. Then let's come forward a little bit and let's bring the opacity down to 0. Let's select all of the keyframes, press F9 for Bezier interpolation. And again, let's rewind and play this back. Cool, that is looking really nice. The last thing I want to do is, right now, all of the glow is kind of concentrated on where the actual morph effect is happening. However, if you had a shot and there was really that much light being emitted from people morphing into one another, you'd imagine that the whole room would be a little bit more lit up. So I want to add another glow, but a really broad and diffuse one, just to kind of add a little bit of brightness into the rest of the shot. For that, I do want that to be the colorful glow, so I'm going to duplicate my Tobias glow layer. I'm going to rename this one to Tobias glow wide. And then I'm simply going to pump up the glow radius on the glow effects. I'm going to push this out by quite a bit, maybe 800-900. I want this to be really wide and diffuse. Let's solo this Tobias glow wide layer to check out what we have. And well, it's just a little bit too diffuse. You can hardly see it. So maybe let's bring up the intensity as well a little bit, maybe to 2 or 3. And maybe I'll bring in the glow radius a little bit as well, maybe around the 700 or 800. Glow intensity maybe around the 3 or so. I want a really wide and diffuse glow that just gets added to the room in general, just brightens everything up a little bit. So this seems a little bit more realistic. Let's unsolo this layer. Let's hide the white glow, so that's without, and that is with the white glow. Now again, I'm finding this a little bit too intense in the center now, so I'm going to bring down the glow intensity of the white glow to maybe around about 2. And on the Tobias glow layer, again, I'm just going to lower the intensity a little bit to maybe round about 0.5. But this is really just now a matter of taste, and just play around with this and make this look any way that you want. Let's rewind one more time and play this back. Nice! I'm actually really happy with this morph effect. Finally, one thing I always like to do with all of my compositions and all of my visual effects is apply a little bit of color correction or color grading to all of the layers in my composition. The reason I like to do that is similar to the principle of using a sandwich press after you've made a sandwich. You may have lots and lots and lots of layers, but until you put them through a process that binds them all together, they're really just independent layers. So one thing that really helps bind all of your visual layers together is to apply some common color correction or color grading, and that can be easily done using adjustment layers. So in our composition, let's create a new adjustment layer. Make sure this is at the very top of your composition, and let's call this one color grading. And to this layer, you can now really apply any type of color adjustment effect that you want. In our Effects and Presets panel, let's clear out our search bar and let's pop open the Color Correction tab. In here, you'll find a whole bunch of different effects, and just feel free to pick and choose. I'm simply going to apply a curves effect to my color grading layer. Now, we haven't gone through the technicalities of the curves effect yet. All I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag at the top of the curve. This is going to just add a little bit more brightness to the bright parts, and then click at the bottom of the curve and drag this down. So this is going to make my dark parts a little bit darker. So this is essentially just adding a bit of contrast into the image, just so the image itself just pops a little bit more. Then under my channels, I'm going to change from RGB to red. So this is the curve for just the red color information in my image. I'm going to click and drag in the middle of this curve to drain a little bit of red from my footage. So I'm going to get a little bit of a green, bluish tint. And then in my channels, let's jump over to the blue channel. Going to click once in the middle to lock it down, and then just pull the bottom up. Just add a little bit more blue into the dark areas. Maybe I'll come back to the RGB channel and make this a little bit more contrasty, so darken the dark areas even more. And again, just play with this, just have fun and tweak this. So essentially, I've just added a little bit of color grading to all of the layers in my composition to kind of bind them together just a little bit more. So this is what it looks without the curves effect, and this is what it looks with the curves effect. And it just makes all of those layers fit together a little bit more because they've all gone through the same processing. They've all had the same effects applied to them, and that kind of creates a little bit of commonality and just binds them all together just a little bit nicer. So let's zoom out of our composition a little bit, rewind, and play back our final morph effect.